Christina here from Sheridan Art and Designs, and today I'm going to be making this robe for Hogwarts Legacy. So I'm starting off in this video using this pattern, which is just your basic, Harry Potter Hogwarts robe pattern that's made by Simplicity. But this one's for more of the original series look. And there are some modifications to make it Hogwarts Legacy. And I'm basing all of this on basically just clips because the game hasn't come out yet. So basing it on just the clips that have been released. But these, there are just a few mods. Mostly this one works. But I also, what I added was a lining to the sleeves, and I changed the shape of the sleeves. So these ones have a really kind of bell shape to them, and I just took the pattern piece and straightened it out. If you want to know more about how to do that, I'll link our video on changing sleeves up here for you guys. But that's basically the only thing I changed. The other thing I added was these stripes on the sleeves, because in the gameplay videos, a lot of them had the 3 stripes, or they had one big one. I'm assuming it's something that you can change when you make your character in the game, but I liked the 3 stripes, so I went with that. But other than that, I just used a cotton blend. It's like a cotton rayon blend, and just some satin red lining. Obviously you can change that to be whatever house color you want it to be. But that's where I started with this one. So with that, let's get into it. Okay, so the first thing we're gonna do is get these red stripes on the sleeves. Obviously, I'm doing red. You can do whatever house color you are. But it's easier to get these on if we do it before we put the sleeve together. So if we do it while the sleeve is flat. But I've done one ahead so you can see what the end result is like. So the easiest way to do that I found was to get just a ribbon instead of using the lining fabric, because the lining fabric that I was using doesn't want to like stay ironed closed, and you want to have a finished edge here. So if that's the case with the lining fabric that you're using, find a ribbon that comes close to the same color or is the same color, and just use that. This is a 7/8 inch ribbon. So almost exactly an inch that I'll be using to put on the sleeve. And like I said, it's just easier to put it on when you can sew it in a straight flat line and you don't have to like try and loop it around the sleeve. So you just do that before you do the seam on the sleeve. So this is just our cutout sleeve piece. And then what I'm going to do is, my best estimate by looking at the pictures was that first stripe was about 2 inches up from the bottom, and then each one after that had about an inch of room in between. So I'm actually going to start my first one 3 inches up from the bottom, just to give myself an inch of hemming and just finishing room down at the bottom of the sleeve for the finished piece. So I'm gonna just mark. I'm gonna take I have a chalk pencil, but you can use a chalk or pencil depending on what color your fabric is. And I'm just going to measure my placement for the ribbon. That way I know that they're gonna be even and they'll look the same and all of that. So from the bottom, I'm just going to measure up 3 inches, bottom of my sleeve here. And then just make a little mark on the side. And that's going to be the bottom of the ribbon. So I'll show you what I mean by that in just a minute, but you just don't want that to be the top point. So 3 inches on the other side, that way you know that it's straight across the sleeve. And then while I'm marking, I'm going to mark my next 2 up. Okay, so from the first mark I made, I'm gonna measure up 2 more inches. So that gives me an inch of space and then allows for the inch of ribbon, right? So this is gonna be the bottom of the ribbon, so I wanna allow for that inch of ribbon where that's gonna go, and then an inch of space before the next ribbon. So 2 inches from there, gonna make a mark. And obviously this isn't going to be exactly perfect because the ribbon isn't exactly an inch, it's 7/8, but it'll be pretty close. No one's gonna take a tape measure to your sleeve, So 2 inches up, make a mark on either side. And then same thing, 2 more inches, right? So you've got your inch of ribbon space and then your next ribbon. And then that should be our 3 ribbons. So we can put these aside. And then what I'm gonna do is take my ribbon, and those marks are going to be the bottom edge of my ribbon, right? So I'm gonna line it up by doing the bottom edge there and the bottom edge there. And that way you know that they're even. And honestly, I don't pre-cut the ribbon. I'm gonna actually leave myself just a little bit of room on either side, just for, you know, insurance, just in cases. But now I'm just gonna pin, and I'm actually gonna pin it, like I'm not gonna pin it vertically, I'm gonna pin it horizontally, so that, because I'm gonna stitch on either side of the ribbon, just so it keeps it both sides down and nothing gets caught and like pulls on it. So I'm gonna stitch the top edge, and I'm gonna stitch the bottom edge on each ribbon. So I'm just going to leave myself like a little 1/4 inch off of the edge here, and then I can trim those once the sleeve's together. But just line my ribbon up with that bottom, with that mark that we made, the bottom edge there. And then I'm just gonna pull it across. You want it to be taut, but you don't want to pull up the edge, right? So you don't want it to be pulling, but you don't wanna leave a bunch of like looseness in the ribbon. So you just want it to be nice and even across. And you can always just eyeball that too. Does that look straight, right? If it looks weird, double check your measuring. But just throw a few extra pins in there so that when I'm stitching on one edge, it doesn't move around on me, because this ribbon is kind of satiny. It will have more of a tendency to shift around on you in your machine than if it was like a more coarse fabric. Okay, so I've got some good pins in that. And then I'm just gonna take my scissors on this edge, and I'm just gonna trim like a 1/4 inch off the edge, just so it's not, you know, super perfect. That way, if it does shift in the machine a little bit, I have a little bit of, you know, give on either side that, you know, I can make things right if I need to. So then we just do the next 2. So you just, same thing, match up that next line with your ribbon, and that's the bottom edge of the ribbon. Flatten it out all the way across. Make sure there's no gapping or extra in there. So when I go to stitch these down, I'm gonna stitch along one edge. I'm not gonna stitch all the way off. I'll just pivot right at the end, stitch up, and then stitch all the way across. So I'll stitch it all in one continuous stitch. I won't stop and start at each end. I just find that easier, and it's not gonna matter because that edge will be caught in the seam allowance when you put the sleeve together. So you won't notice you know, the difference if you don't stitch down one side. But so I just start at one end, go all the way across, up, and then all the way back across. That way you're just making one stitch line, and you don't have to stop and start and, you know, knot a bunch of places to make sure it doesn't unravel. And the other thing I did, which I don't know if it would have a huge impact if you didn't do this, but it just made me feel better about it, is that when I started on one side with one ribbon, and then I started on the other side with the other ribbon. It's kind of an old quilting trick. When you're stitching a lot of straight lines together, your fabric can sometimes shift like this if you go only in one direction. It's just because of the pull of the machine. It kind of starts to make your fabric tilt a little. So what I did was just, and that's how you do it in quilting too, is if you stitch one vertical or horizontal line one direction, and then you come up the other way for the next line, it keeps everything more even. So that's just what I did on this, just to make sure it didn't like pull the sleeve in a weird way. Because there's nothing worse than like making a sleeve and it does like this to you all the time. So I just to, you know, as a little extra insurance, I stitched from one side to the other on one ribbon, and then from the opposite way on the next ribbon. Okay, last one. Same thing, that's that third line that we have. pin that down. And then I always once I have these pinned, I'm just gonna give it a good look to make sure it all looks even and straight before I go stitch it. Just because you never know, sometimes something goes wrong when you pin, or you laid it down weird, or, you know, just give it, you know, a once over. Make sure like the spacing looks even, make sure that the lines look straight before you stitch it on, because it's much easier to fix it now than once you stitch it on and you go, oh, that's not really straight, I don't like that. Okay, and I'm gonna just trim this side off. Perfect. Okay, so before I go to the machine, that's what it looks like now. So it's all pinned on, and it looks pretty straight and even. I'm happy with that. So I'm just gonna stitch the ribbons down, and then I'll come back and I'll show you the seam on the sleeve, because you'll wanna make sure that you match up the edges of the ribbon so that they aren't off when you have the seam. So you can see here, like, they match up on the seam. They're not like, you know, sitting like this on the sleeve. You want them to match so that they look continuous. So I'll go stitch those down and then we'll come back. Okay, so we have our stripes onto our flat sleeve, and now we just need to put the sleeve together. So what we're going to do is fold those stripes to the inside, right sides together. We're gonna match our notches, but most importantly, we're gonna try and match these stripes. So you wanna match each end of the stripe together so that they don't look off on the seam. So what we're going to do is kind of start down here. I'm gonna put a pin kind of at the end here so that the ends match. And then I'll put one here with our notches so that our notches match. I'm just kind of getting the big, like, we want to make sure that matches. We want to make sure, you know, all the important landmarks. And then I'll put a pin here at the other end to make sure this end matches. Okay, now we can kind of use the rest of this to line up our ribbons here. Hopefully they're close already. Hopefully there's not a lot of pulling that you have to do. If there is, that means that you didn't mark your start and end points evenly across your sleeve. So you might, if it's like really off, you might want to go back and like straighten your ribbon out. But if they're pretty straight, there should just be a little minor kind of corrections going here just to line them up. But the thing you want to be careful of, especially if you're using a satin ribbon like me, is that once you get this into the machine, that satin's going to tend to slip. So you want to make sure you're pinning that stuff down so that it doesn't move around in your machine. Also think about like your feed dog underneath your machine will naturally kind of pull the bottom one. So it can get off. So what you're going to want to do after you pin them is, I always start at this end of the sleeve so that I can make sure that those things are lined up. And then as I go down, I can kind of, you know, if there's anything that I need to hide, I can kind of hide it at that end a little bit better than if these are off, because these are going to be really standout pieces that if they're off, you're going to really notice, right? So what I do is I'm going to sandwich my ribbons together, line them up so that either end is lined up and that your sleeve seam is lined up. And then I'm going to put a pin right in the middle, and then I'm going to put a pin on either side right next to it, just so I know that when I'm approaching it, it's not going to move, and then when I'm going over the top of it, it's right where I want it to be, and then as I'm coming off of it, it's still staying right there. Nothing's going to shift on me, right? So that's what I do with each of the ribbons. You just line them up, and these are lining up fairly nicely on their own. There's not a lot of tugging that I have to do to make them line up. Even with that though, I mean, there's the potential for them not being 100% perfect. If you look really closely at the one I already did, like ever so slightly this way or that way, if that bothers you, you can always just like rip it out and do it again and again until you get it exactly perfect. But I allow myself that little bit of room. I think that's fine. You know, if it's under 1/8 of an inch or so, I'm kind of like, it's okay. And for the most part, what moved was just those little tiny ends. I mean, it's probably not even a 1/16 of an inch difference. So I think, you know, that's pretty good. Especially for something that, think about this, the seam is gonna be on the inside of your sleeve. It's gonna be the one closest to your body. So not a lot of people are gonna see it, let alone close enough to analyze it. So, you know, judge for yourself. If you want it to be perfect, that's okay. Make sure it's perfect. If you are okay with a little bit of difference, then that's okay. So now I've got all these pinned right in place. And if you notice once you take it to your machine and you're stitching that it has moved, don't keep going. Like stop and fix it before you stitch it, right? Okay, and then I have a little bit, you know, I'm gonna have a little bit of extra in my sleeve, but that's okay, it'll get taken up, but I'm gonna throw a pin just kind of in the middle here so that it is even across. Okay, so now I'm just gonna stitch that seam, and then both of our sleeves will be assembled and we'll be ready to set them aside and work on our front and back pieces. And then the hood and the sleeves, this project's gonna go together really fast. There's not a ton of pieces, so it'll be a great project to put together really quickly. But I'm gonna go stitch this and then we'll be back with our front and back pieces to get those assembled. Okay, so we now have 2 sleeves, and this one actually lined up even better than the last one, so that's all good. You can see it's all lined up nice, and then I just pressed the seam open and flipped it right side out. And I'm gonna lay those off to the side now because the next step is to assemble our front and back pieces. Now the only thing I've done so far on these pieces is I've run my stay stitching on the collar lines, on the necklines of the both front pieces and both back pieces. So I've run those stay stitches and that just keeps, it seems like a silly step because you're like, oh, I'm not even stitching it to anything, but it really is important. It's one of the things I don't skip because it keeps this curve that's cut on a bias from stretching out. So when you go to put your lining or your facing on or any collars on, in this case it'll be a hood and a facing that we'll have to put on. If you haven't done the stay stitching, there's a possibility that as you've been maneuvering these pieces around, that bias has stretched out and now they're not going to fit the other pieces that you cut, and it'll be really baggy and hard to kind of put those pieces together. So just do yourself a favor, do a quick stay stitching on those collar edge pieces inside. So for this it's 5/8 seam allowance, so put it on the inside of that. So put it at a 1/2 inch or 3/8 inch. Just so it's on the inside of the seam allowance, because then once you put the pieces together, no one will ever see it, but it will keep it from being misshapen when you're putting stuff together. So I've run those stay stitches and then I did the main back seam. So I put my 2 back seams together and just ran that straight stitch all the way down the back. So the next step is to put your fronts to your back. So the first place that you do that is the shoulder seams. So what you're gonna do is just match notches, just like we did on the sleeves. There should be a notch on your shoulder seam right here, and it will match the notch on the front shoulder seam. Make sure you're putting right sides of the fabric together. So this whole thing should be inside out at this point. So you're putting your notches together. Now, how much you pin this is totally up to you. I usually don't really pin it. I'll pin like, you know, the front, the ends and the notches, just to make sure that like nothing weird shifts or happens. But you can pin this all the way along if you want, if that makes you more comfortable. It'll keep things from shifting more. It's really to your comfort level at this point. But you just want to make sure that like, okay, the collar, sorry. The collar edges are matching the shoulder seam edges are matching and those notches are matched up. Those are the important pieces. And then you're going to do that on the other side. So the first one you'll stitch is the shoulder seam, and then you can, at the same time, you can just run the side seams as well. These are all just very straight lines, nothing weird about them. You just make sure that all your notches match up and all of your start and end match up. And then because these pieces are so big, and like robes and cloaks and stuff can be fun and easy and fast that way because the pieces are big and they go together really fast. You don't have a bunch of like smaller pieces that you like have a front and a side front and a side and a side back and a back, you know, to put all together. You just have like front and back and you stitch them together. So these can go together really fast and they can be great for beginner projects or just a quick weekend project, or like a last minute, I don't know, I got invited to a Halloween party and I don't know what to do. They can be great for that too. Okay, so I have my shoulder seams together. I'm also, while I'm here, just gonna pin my side seams, make sure my notches match and all that, and then I'll sew them all at once at the machine. So same thing, same principles apply. Right sides together, make sure you don't have any weird twisties in your fabric, and make sure your notches match. I match my notches first, and then I go to my end points, just because the notches kind of are a little bit more important than the start and end points, especially at the bottom, because that's going to get caught up in the hem. So if it's a little bit uneven at the bottom, like if one kind of slipped down and is longer, it's not as big of a deal. But you want the notches to match because those can be higher up on the garment. They can be around the waist and things. So you don't want like the waist of your back to be up, you know, off kilter with the waist of your front side. So match your notches first and then match your front. And then I like to match my, when I'm doing the sides, I like to match the one up here first, which is kind of the top of that side seam. It's the one that goes to the sleeve, so that it's a lot easier if that isn't, you know, off. If anything is off, you kind of want it to be the bottom of the garment, because like I said, you're going to turn it under into the hem anyway, so no one will know that it was off. In fact, I'm not even going to pin that. I'm just going to pin my notches and then right at the sleeve in the arm side for my side. And then I'll just stitch it down. I'll start at the arm side point and go down. Here we go. Okay, so matching my notches on this other side, and then we're gonna go stitch. And then once we come back, we're gonna be ready to set our sleeves in. So we'll take those sleeves that we just did and we'll set them into the garment. I'm going to line them afterwards. So I'm going to take my sleeve linings after they're already in the garment and I'll stitch them in then, and I'll show you how to do that. If you decide, I'm only lining certain pieces, so I'm lining the hood and the sleeves, and then I'm just going to use a facing on the inside of the robe instead of lining the whole robe. If you decide you want to line the whole robe, that's totally fine, and you could just bag it. You could do, you know, just cut out all the same pieces in your lining and then assemble both separately. So you basically will have a lining robe and a outer robe, and then you just stitch them together at the end. And we've talked about that in one of our other videos about linings versus facings. For this one, I've just decided to do facing. It's less fabric and it's a little bit faster. So, okay, so I'm all pinned up and I'm gonna go stitch these and then we'll come back and set our sleeves in, okay? Okay, we're back with our sleeves. We're ready to put our sleeves in. Our front and our back are all together, and I set one sleeve in already. I pressed my seams open. I'll come back later and do finishing on those. I haven't decided how I'm gonna finish them yet. So you can see I already got my one sleeve in, and then we're going to put our next sleeve in now. So you want your garment, your robe, inside out for this, and then you want your sleeve right side out. And then these 3 dots at the top here, of your sleeve that you should have marked when you were cutting these out are going to become very important. There is no gathering stitch on this sleeve, so you just have to kind of spread the fullness out as evenly as you can across the whole arm side. So that's the only real big challenge with this sleeve. But other than that, it should go in pretty neatly for you. So I'm going to just put my sleeve right side out inside my inside out garment. So you should see the seams on the garment, and then you put your sleeve on the inside. So again, you're still going to be putting right sides together. So that's a quick way to match, right? So like this is the right side of the garment. I'm putting my right side sleeve in there, right? So now the first thing I match up on my sleeves is this top dot. Okay, so your center of the 3 dots that you have matches that shoulder seam. So I'm just going to place that right on the shoulder seam. And then put a pin there. The next thing I'm going to match is down at the bottom. I'm going to match the seam on the sleeve with the side seam of the garment we just did. Now, if they're pressed open like this, it makes it pretty easy to match them because they kind of will bump up against each other. If you nestle them next to each other, they'll kind of nicely just bump up next to each other, and then you can put a pin right in there. Okay. And the more careful you are about that seam, the straighter and more it'll match. So if you look at like the under arm on a garment that you have, hopefully the sleeve seam and the side seam match up right there in the arm side. It's not the end of the world if they don't match. You want them to be close though, because if they're not close, your sleeve will twist on you. And there's nothing more annoying than like having to like keep pulling your sleeve back, right? Like, so annoying. So I just am like extra careful about that one. And when you get to that point when you're stitching, if you don't feel like they're super even, just before you stitch it, pull that pin out and readjust. Okay, so the next thing I do is match my notches. So you should have a single notch and a double notch, and those should match on the arm side. So you just match those as closely as you can. And these should be kind of on the bottom half of the sleeve. Match those on either side. And then I come back up to the top and I match my other 2 dots on either side. So you should have 2 dots on your robe and then 2 more dots on your sleeve to match. So you just match those up. Sometimes it's easier when a sleeve has a gathering stitch because you can kind of fill the fullness in a little bit more evenly, but that does result in kind of a puffy sleeve look. So this is more of a straight sleeve, so you just have to be careful when you're matching everything and try and get the fullness of the sleeve to match the arm side as closely as possible, or at least spread it out evenly. So now I have my last dot, matching my last dot over here, putting a pin in that. Okay, so now I've pinned all of my kind of registration points, right? So I've matched my 3 dots at the top, I've matched my seams and my 2 notches at the bottom. And so now I have kind of these other 2 halves to fill in. So you'll notice that your sleeve is baggier than the arm side. So you'll have extra sleeve and you just have to even that out along your arm side. So what I do is I kind of just let it fall in as it's going to. And then I pin in the middle. I kind of like divide it in half, right? So like I have my notch and my dot here, and then this is what I have left to pin. So I'll kind of pin, all right, in the middle. So I'm dividing that fullness in half on either side. And then I'll pin it again in the middle again, so that I'm dividing that fullness out throughout the seam as evenly as possible. If you notice that you got more on one side than another, just unpin and repin, shift it around a little bit. Like, see, I did a little bit here. So I'm going to kind of zhuzh it around. I'm gonna go there. A little bit more fullness on this half than I did on the other half. So I'm just gonna even it out a little bit. There we go. Okay. And then the same thing on this side. So I have my dot and my notch on this side, and then I have all this fullness to fill in. So again, I'm just going to pinch in the middle, try and get, you know, the same amount of fullness on either side. So you can see I have kind of a loop left and a little bit of a loop left there. And then divide that in half again, try and get another pin in there. The sleeves are the one place that I always pin a lot, because if a sleeve moves on you in the machine, it's really hard to get the sleeve fullness even. So if you pin consistently, evenly throughout the whole sleeve, it will go together in the machine much easier for you. If you don't pin enough, you'll kind of push this fullness just ahead of you in the machine, and then once you get to the end, it'll all be bunched up there, which you don't want. You want to divide it evenly. The other trick for that is put the sleeve down on the machine. So stitch with the robe side up, and then you'll get the feed dogs will take up a little bit of that fullness for you, so you're not fighting it quite as much. And see, again, I still have a little bit more there than I would like, so I'm just gonna put some of it to the other side, even that out a little bit. Push. There. Okay, so I have some pretty even pins all the way around my sleeve here. I actually might throw one just in between the dots at the top of the sleeve and the side dots, just because there's some fullness there that I think I just want to pin down. So like I said, sleeves are one thing that I always overpin, just because it makes my life easier at the machine. So, okay, I think I have enough pins. I'm gonna go stitch that, and then we'll be moving on to the hood. So I'll see you guys back here in a minute. Okay, so we're ready for our hood. You can see our robe is mostly together. We have got sleeves on it, front and back all together. So now we're gonna work on our hood before we put our facing on, and then some last little finishing touches. So the next step is hood. So you're gonna take your outer hood and the lining of your hood, if you're choosing to line it, and you're going to put them right sides together and then stitch them along this upper and the outer seam. You're gonna leave the front, what will be like where your face goes, you're gonna leave that unstitched and the bottom edge unstitched. So you just wanna stitch those separately, and then we'll come back and put them together before we attach it to the robe. All right? Okay, so I stitched my two hood pieces separately, and then I flipped the red one right side out, and put it right sides together with the black one. And then I just stitched along this front bit, which will be the bit that goes on the face like this, right? So that'll be the front part of the hood. And then what I did is I went back and understitched there, just so that the lining doesn't curl outward. Because you want it to have, when it lays, you want it to be black on the outside with just the red or whatever color on the inside showing. You don't want it to kind of curl outward, and you achieve that by understitching. So if you don't know what understitching is, all I did was I took, when you stitch this seam, press your seam allowances towards your lining, so towards your red or your color, and then do another line of stitching on the inside of, on the seam allowance, right? So about 1/8 or 1/4 of an inch into the seam allowance, do another line of stitching there, and and it'll make everything kind of roll the right way. But you won't see it on the outside because you're not stitching to the outer, you're only stitching to the inner. And if you want that not to show as much as possible on the lining, what I did was matched my bobbin thread to the lining and then matched my top thread to the outer. And I did that when I was stitching this seam the first time too, just in case anything shows through, the threads match the side that they're on. But you can see, like, you can barely see that understitching line on the very inside of the hood, but it does keep it from rolling outside, and then giving it a good press also will help that. So now you can see, like, the red lining isn't kind of doing one of these, it's sitting, you know, inside the hood pretty well. So now we just have a little thread to trim there. Now we just have to put the hood onto here, and basically you're going to do that the same way you would kind of an arm. You're going to a sleeve into an arm side. You're going to just match your notches along your neckline, put them on the neckline here, just like you would any other piece, right? So you're going to take your robe and take your hood. And if you want to, you can baste this lower edge first, just so it doesn't get squirrely on you in the machine. If you want to just throw a quick basting stitch there, that way you know that the lining and the hood are matching 100% before you even put it to the robe. But again, right sides together, right? You're gonna put your hood onto the neckline of your robe. So you have these two notches down at the bottom here. And then you're just gonna match your notches and your center seam. So just like the arm, you're gonna want that center back seam to match the center seam of the hood. It will be a little bit noticeable if they're like way off. So you just wanna make sure that you're lining all of them up. And then you're gonna throw a pin in it. Okay. And then you're gonna match your notches. On either side of that center seam. And then this pattern does have a back facing, so there'll be a facing that goes over this seam and kind of gives it a finish. So you don't have to worry about finishing this seam off. But then you'll just go around the rest of the hood here. There is a dot on the hood, a mark, that'll match the seam from the shoulder seam. So just want to bring this around, match it up as much as you can. And then we'll stitch that and put the facing in. We're getting almost to the end here. It's all going together. And then you just have kind of your finishing touches, or if you want to put pockets in, or if you want to, you know, make it do anything special, so a little Hogwarts crest on it, or, you know, anything like that, you can do that all at the end once we have it all put together. So after the facing goes on, it'll just be hemming. You'll want to hem the bottom edge, and then you'll come back to the sleeves. I'm going to line the sleeves. You don't have to. If you don't want to, you would just turn your cuffs under and stitch them as a hem, just like you will the bottom. If you want to line them, I'll show you how I'm going to do that. And if you're lining the whole thing, you would just bag your lining and stitch it with the hem all at once. and that matches that neck curve nicely. All right, I'm gonna go stitch this hood on, and then we'll come back. Okay, guys? Okay, I have the hood on. I realized that I deviated from what the instructions tell you to say on that, so I just wanted to tell you what I did. The instructions just tell you to baste, but I don't really like basting. So I just pinned it really well and then stitched it, but I didn't stitch it at 5/8 seam allowance. I stitched it at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, just so that when I stitch the facing on at 5/8, there you won't see that stitching, but it will keep it really secure and on. So that's what I did. I just stitched it at 1/2 inch instead of 5/8. You won't see it, but it makes that hood extra strong, and especially if you're making this for like a kid, and you think like that hood might get some wear and tear or get caught on something and yanked, that extra line of stitching can help. The next thing we're doing is the facing. So you have 2 front facings and then this back facing. I've already put my inner facing on. Use whatever kind of inner facing you like. I used a like mid-weight fusible. And you're gonna just stitch the shoulder seams. So you're basically gonna make a U, a big U shape of this. And then on the unnotched edges, so this one has a notch that's obviously gonna match this notch in the front. So on the other side of that, you're gonna wanna finish that edge because it's gonna just sit on the inside of the rope. So you don't want that to be a raw edge. What I'm going to do is just do a narrow 1/4 inch hem. So I'm gonna fold under a 1/4 inch and then fold under another 1/4 inch and then stitch right along there all the way around. And then we'll come back and we'll put it onto the robe, and that's one of your last steps. So I'll go do that and I'll come right back. Okay, so we have our lining in, or facing in now, as you can see, and I ran an understitching on the inside of that as well, just so that it lays nicely towards the inside. You can see it's not rolling out like this. It's laying nicely towards the inside. So our next steps will be to do the hem on the bottom and to line the sleeves. And then I'm gonna throw probably a little wand pocket into the facing here. That'll be hidden on the inside. But this is coming along great, and we'll come back and do the hem. Okay guys, this is day 2. I took a break last night and came back to it this morning. So I've done a few things this morning that I wanna walk you through really quickly before I just show you how to line the sleeve. So far what I've done is I just pinned up my hem, and I just folded that over twice so it's nice and finished edge, and then I'll stitch that. But I just pinned it up. And then the other thing that I did was I added a little wand pocket on the inside. So on this facing piece that, you know, can fold out here, I stitched a 1-inch buttonhole, and then on the underside I'm going to stitch a little pocket sleeve. So all I did was cut a 2-inch piece of fabric that was scrap from my rope, a little 2-inch piece of fabric by about 12 inches. I folded the edges inward so that they're finished, there's no fraying on the inside, and then I just pinned them over the top of this buttonhole. There's about an inch. It finishes on top of the buttonhole by an inch, and then it runs down the inside of this facing, and I'm just going to stitch that on. And then you can take a wand that you have, and you'll be able to just stick it inside that buttonhole and run it down the sleeve, and then you'll have a little inside pocket for your wand. This one's a little longer than the one that I have sewed, that one works. This one will work a little better. It'll slide a little farther in, but if you have a wand at home, you can just measure the length of it. Make sure that you leave a little bit of your handle sticking out so that you can grab it out and it doesn't slide all the way down in your pocket. So just make sure that the length of your pocket is a little bit shorter than the full length of your wand. But yeah, so then I'm just gonna stitch that in. And then finally, let's get to lining your sleeves. So I have my sleeve lining here. I've done the seam on it, just like we did on our sleeves before, and it's inside out. So what I wanna do is I wanna flip the robe inside out. And this is kind of easier if you do it on a dress form, but you can do it on the table too. But you're just gonna flip it inside out, and then you leave the robe sleeve in there, right? So that should all just be left as if it was sitting perfectly on, you know, on the outside. You just flip it in. And then you take your sleeve lining and you're going to pin it just like this, with, you know, the right side is on the inside, the bottom, you should be able to match your notches and all of that on here. You're gonna pin that, and then you're gonna stitch it at 5/8 inch seam allowance, right? So you should be able to just go like this, match that seam, bring around and match that, this notch here, and bring around and match this notch over here. And then you're going to pin about halfway up, pretty much as far up as you can go. So you're gonna pin it halfway up, and then you're gonna be able to machine stitch. So you're gonna take it to your machine and stitch this right on that same 5/8 inch seam allowance that you used to attach the sleeve to the robe. You're gonna stitch it about halfway up that arc. And then what you'll do is you'll take the sleeve lining and you'll shove it into the sleeve, and that'll bring the top up to the top on the inside. All twisty on me, but this will flip right side out, right? So you'll stitch it there, and then you'll flip your sleeve into the sleeve so that the right side of the fabric shows on the inside of the sleeve. And then when you do that, you'll be able to put the top towards the top of the sleeve, and then you'll just fold that down and fold it down, and then you'll just hand stitch. You'll just do a little whip stitch just on the upper curve of that. So that's all there is to it, because and then you can see on this side I've already done it. You can see I machine stitched this one, and then I just did a hand stitch on this top curve, and it is already lined nicely. And then I just folded up my hem on that sleeve end, and I'll run a quick top stitch around just to keep that hemmed. So that's what's left to do here. There's not a lot left. We'll just line that other sleeve, stitch our hem, and stitch our little wand pocket on here. And then it's pretty much done. I have my little patch coming in the mail, so we'll throw the patch on, and then the robe is all done. So I'll run to the machine and do all of that last minute stitching and hand stitching, and then we'll come back for the final. All right, guys, that's it. ironed on our little Gryffindor patch here and put a wand in our wand pocket, and our robe is all ready to go. So thanks for joining us. I hope this was helpful to you. Let us know in the comments below if you've made one or if you've changed anything about yours and how excited you are for Hogwarts Legacy to come out. I know I'm super excited for it. Otherwise, I'll catch you in the next video. Thanks, guys.